How World War II changed the modern world. Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that everything you knew about borders, governments, economies, and even medicine had been completely rewritten overnight. That is not a hypothetical thought experiment. That is precisely what happened between 1939 and 1945, and the consequences of those 6 catastrophic years continue to shape every single aspect of your daily life right now. World War II was not merely the largest military conflict in human history. It was the event that created the modern world itself. To understand how deeply the war reshaped civilization, we first need to understand the world that existed before it. The 1930s were defined by instability. The Great Depression had devastated economies across the globe. Colonial empires still stretched from Africa to Southeast Asia. The League of Nations, created after World War I to prevent future conflicts, had proven toothless and ineffective. Fascism was rising across Europe and Asia. Democratic governments were struggling to maintain legitimacy. The international order was fragile, deeply unequal, and built on the assumption that European powers would continue to dominate the planet indefinitely. Then came the war, and that entire structure collapsed under its own weight. The conflict began officially in September 1939 when Germany invaded Poland, though the roots of tension had been growing for years through events like Japan's invasion of Manchuria in 1931 and Italy's aggression in Ethiopia in 1935. Within 6 years, the war would involve over 30 nations, mobilize more than 100 million military personnel, and result in between 70 and 85 million deaths, making it the deadliest conflict in recorded human history. Roughly 3% of the entire world population perished. These are not just statistics. They represent the complete destruction of the world as people knew it, and from that destruction emerged something entirely new. One of the most immediate and lasting consequences of World War II was the total restructuring of global power. Before the war, Britain, France, Germany, and Japan were among the most powerful nations on Earth. After it, they were either destroyed or so severely weakened that they could no longer project global influence. Into that vacuum stepped 2 new superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. These 2 nations had fundamentally different ideological systems, and their rivalry, known as the Cold War, would dominate global politics for the next 4.5 decades. Every regional conflict, every political alliance, every arms race from 1945 to 1991 can be traced back to the power vacuum created by World War II. The creation of the United Nations in 1945 represented humanity's second attempt at building a framework for international cooperation and conflict resolution. Unlike the League of Nations, the United Nations had actual mechanisms for collective security, including a Security Council with enforcement powers. While the organization has faced criticism and limitations throughout its history, it established the fundamental principle that nations have responsibilities to one another and that war should be a last resort rather than a first response. More than 75 years later, the United Nations remains the primary global forum for diplomatic engagement, with 193 member states. The war also fundamentally accelerated the collapse of European colonialism. Before 1939, Britain, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Portugal controlled vast territories across Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. The war exposed the vulnerability of these empires. European powers that had presented themselves as invincible were now fighting for their own survival. Japan's rapid conquest of European colonies in Southeast Asia demonstrated that European military supremacy was a myth. Independence movements across the colonized world gained enormous momentum from this revelation. Between 1945 and 1975, dozens of nations achieved independence in what became known as the Great Wave of Decolonization. India gained independence in 1947. Ghana in 1957. Nigeria in 1960. Vietnam ultimately after decades of brutal struggle. The map of the world was literally redrawn, and the modern concept of national self-determination became a dominant political force. The Holocaust, the systematic murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others by the Nazi regime, produced consequences that continue to reverberate today. The sheer scale of industrialized genocide forced the international community to confront questions about human rights, state responsibility, and the limits of national sovereignty that had never been seriously addressed before. The United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, establishing for the first time a universal framework of rights belonging to every human being regardless of nationality. The Nuremberg trials established the groundbreaking legal precedent that individuals, including heads of state and military commanders, could be held personally accountable for crimes against humanity. These principles form the foundation of international humanitarian law as it exists today. The economic transformation brought about by World War II was equally profound. The Bretton Woods Conference of 1944 established the architecture of the post-war global economy. Held in New Hampshire with representatives from 44 allied nations, the conference created the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and established the US dollar as the world's reserve currency, pegged to gold. This framework provided the stability necessary for the extraordinary economic expansion that followed the war. Western Europe and Japan, rebuilt largely with American assistance through the Marshall Plan and similar programs, experienced decades of rapid economic growth. The Marshall Plan alone provided approximately $13 billion in economic assistance to Western Europe, roughly $160 billion in today's money. The result was not just economic recovery but the construction of modern consumer economies that became the template for development worldwide. The technological acceleration produced by wartime necessity permanently changed human civilization. Radar technology, developed urgently to detect incoming German aircraft during the Battle of Britain, became the foundation of modern air traffic control and weather forecasting systems. The jet engine, developed simultaneously in Britain and Germany during the war, made commercial aviation possible and shrunk the world. The atomic bomb, developed through the Manhattan Project at a cost of approximately $2 billion and involving more than 130,000 workers, inaugurated the nuclear age. While the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki killed between 129,000 and 226,000 people and remained deeply controversial, nuclear deterrence theory arguably prevented direct military conflict between superpowers for the next 75 years, a period sometimes called the Long Peace. Medical advances driven by wartime necessity were also extraordinary. Penicillin had been discovered by Alexander Fleming in 1928, but it was mass production urgency driven by the war effort that turned it into a widely available medicine. By D-Day in June 1944, enough penicillin had been produced to treat all Allied casualties. After the war, this capability was directed towards civilian medicine, saving hundreds of millions of lives from bacterial infections that had previously been fatal. Blood banking techniques, trauma surgery, psychiatry, and rehabilitation medicine all advanced dramatically because of the massive scale of wartime casualties that demanded medical innovation. The social fabric of the world also changed permanently. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers across Allied nations, filling industrial and professional roles that had previously been exclusively male. In the United States alone, the number of working women increased by 60% during the war years. While many women were pushed back out of the workforce after male veterans returned, the psychological shift was irreversible. Women had demonstrated beyond any reasonable argument that they were capable of performing virtually any task a man could perform. This realization was a powerful accelerant for the feminist movements of the 1950s and 1960s. The civil rights movement in the United States also gained crucial momentum from the war. African American soldiers who fought and died for democracy abroad returned home to find racial segregation still waiting for them. That contradiction became impossible to sustain indefinitely. The war also gave birth to the information age more directly than most people realize. The need to break enemy codes and process complex military calculations drove the development of early computing machines. Alan Turing's work at Bletchley Park, developing methods to crack the German Enigma cipher, laid conceptual foundations for modern computer science. The first electronic computers emerged directly from wartime research projects. Without the computational demands of World War II, the digital revolution that defines contemporary life might have been delayed by decades.